Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Today's video is going to be consisted of 3 different race riots, and the 3 are going to be the Verdun, Illinois race riot of 1898, the Wilmington race riot of 1898, and the Newburgh, New York race riot of 1899. So without further ado, let's get straight into the video. Okay, so the first riot we're going to be talking about is the Verdun, Illinois race riot of 1898. So this race riot was an example of the combination between labor and racial violence in the late 19th and early 20th century of the United States. This was following a United Mine Workers, the UMW, national coal strike in 1897, which was a new 40 cents per ton rate, which was agreed on by all the Illinois coal companies and the Illinois district of the UMW in January of 1898. But then the Chicago Verdun Coal Company abrogated the agreement and brought in African American miners from Birmingham, Alabama as strikebreakers to work the mines at Verdun, a town which is 25 miles southwest of Springfield, Illinois. So on September 25th of 1898, a trainload of Birmingham miners arrived in Verdun, and a stockade around the mine entrance had already been constructed next to the railroad tracks to protect the arriving African American miners. And about 300 armed, striking white miners, which were basically the reason why the African Americans were brought in from Birmingham because to be strikebreakers, because these 300 white miners were striking due to lack of pay. So they brought in different people, and they brought in the African Americans from Birmingham. So these white miners are mostly immigrants from southern and eastern Europe that came from throughout central Illinois to meet the train of strikebreakers. And the train slowed down near the Verdun station, but then sped past the station and went on to Springfield, Illinois, without trying to drop off the miners in the mine stockade. And they didn't try to drop off these African American miners to basically be the strike breakers for the situation. So the white UMW miners continued to patrol the tracks around Verdun, so these African American workers couldn't get into the area, expecting the mine owners. The white mine owners expected the owners of this minefield to try to bring the strike breakers back into town, but by October 12th of 1898, their numbers had swelled to 2,000 when the mine owner made another run on the Verdun station. And then shooting started to begin as the train sped past the deposition place with another load of Birmingham miners and their families, but this time it actually stopped at the nearby stockade. And this is when a fight began between the Thiel Agency detectives from St. Louis on the train car platforms, which was supplemented by the Chicago police inside the stockade against many of the white Union miners in a field opposite of the stockade. 7 striking miners and 5 guards were killed, with as many as 30 individuals being wounded, including a lot of the black Birmingham miners. And this violence kind of lasted for about 10 minutes at the time, and then the train engineer, wounded in the arm from the shooting, sped out of Verdun to Springfield, Illinois, where the injured and the dead were taken off the train. At this time, all the people from Alabama were promised care and transportation by UMW officials and were persuaded to come back to the Union Hall the next day. And on October the 13th, the Union kind of abruptly announced it would not protect or care for any of the African Americans beyond 6 o'clock that evening. And a pair of black miners tried to run from the Union Hall to the train station, but were caught by white miners and were beaten. And then that's when a mob gathered at the Union Hall threatening to kill the strikebreakers, but the mayor of Springfield calmed them down and arranged to send the Birmingham miners to St. Louis on the next train. That's where they were abandoned without money, food, clothes, or any belongings of any sort. So that's when the state troops were called into Verdun at that point, and there was, well, they say no more violence, but it was just put to a halt because inquests and investigations were being conducted and charges were filed against a couple of white striking miners, but overall, no trials brought any convictions to any of them that started the fight, and the company basically acceded to the strikers' demands, and then the mine just reopened shortly with only white UMW workers, and Verdun became a sundown town, and as of late of 1908, only one of the 3,000 miners in Macoupin County, where Verdun is located, was African American. So the next race riot is the Wilmington Race Riot of 1898. This riot was a politically motivated attack by the whites against the city's leading African American citizens. This riot really documented the length to which the white Democrats went to regain political domination of the South after Reconstruction happened. The violence began on Thursday, November 10th, in the predominantly African American city of Wilmington, North Carolina. At that time, this was the state's largest metropolis. So, statewide election returns had recently signaled a shift in power with the Democrats taking over. And this was because they were taking over the North Carolina state legislature. The city of Wilmington, however, remained in Republican hands, primarily because of the solid base of African American voters. So on November 10th, Alfred Moore Waddell, a former Confederate officer, and he was also a white supremacist, and led a group of townsmen to force the ouster of Wilmington's city officials. So Waddell relied on an editorial printed in the African American owned Wilmington Daily Record as the catalyst for the riot. Alex Manley, the editor of the Daily Record, had published an editorial in early November arguing that poor white men are careless in the matter of protecting their women, paraphrasing articles from Ida B. Wells on the subject of lynching and African American violence. Manley opened that with this quote specifically, that our experiences among poor white people in the country teaches us that women of that race are not any more particular in the matter of clandestine meetings with colored men than the white men with the colored woman. Manley's discussion of this subject of interracial relationships exposed the reality of exploitation of black women by white men and challenged the myth of pure white womanhood. So 48 hours after Manley's editorial ran, Waddell led 500 white men to the quarters of the Daily Record on 7th Street, and this is when a mob broke out windows and set the building on fire. Manley and other high-profile African Americans fled the city, but even so, at least 14 African Americans were killed that day. An eyewitness later wrote that African Americans fled to the swamps or hid in the African American cemetery at the edge of town, when their criminal behavior resulted in neither federal sanctions nor condemnation from the state. Waddell and his men formalized their control of Wilmington. So they basically ran out the African Americans and then did all this because they wanted political stands in that city, and that's what they got because later then the after this formalization, the posse forced the Republican members of the city council and the mayor to resign. And that's when Waddell assumed the mayoral seat, because over the next 2 years, North Carolina passed the grandfather clause as one in a series of laws designed to limit the voting rights of African Americans. So after this article dropped from the Daily Record, Waddell was immediately on it, and he devised this entire plan, and there was no pushback whatsoever. The African Americans didn't get any help from the situation because the National Guard was called in for help because the mayor of the city was African American, and he called for help, and none of them came to help the situation. And even the people that murdered these 14 African Americans, they didn't get charged for any of this, and overall at the end Waddell won and he became the mayor of the city. So the last riot is going to be the Newburgh, New York race riot of 1899. The New York race riot was basically the breaking point of racial tension between non-black and black brickyard workers after these brickyard owners began hiring black workers to fill labor shortages. Beforehand, local brickyards had hired Irish workers, then Hungarian, Italian, and Arab workers, with only two brickyards in the city hiring black workers. According to the local newspapers, there were some racial tension before the riot, mainly because the various workers, including the few black laborers, got along, but demand for brick was high in 1899, and brickyard owners were anxious to profit from high prices. So they sent agents to the South to recruit more black workers. And as the number of black workers increased and began working side by side of these other non-black workers, strikes and incidents of racial violence kind of increased throughout brickyards in the region. During springtime of 1899, several strikes broke out at multiple brickyards as non-black workers protested the hiring of more African Americans. And on June 17th, a black laborer was shot at Peck's Brickyard in the nearby Harver Straw, and local papers reported an increase in crime and incidents of racial violence. And this included the use of knives, sharp razors, and even regular long sticks. And on the evening of July 27th of 1899, near Freeman and Haymond Brickyard in the town of Newburgh, a race riot broke out between the black and Arab brickyard workers, and both groups were kind of equal size, of 80 to 100 men per side, armed with stones, knives, clubs, and some even had large pistols or automatic weapons. And this violence lasted for a few hours as the black group initially chased off the Arab rioters, and eventually they returned with more guns and fired multiple shots to the black men, and they ended up dying from the situation. But others reported that injuries included cuts and bruises, and there were over 30 people that were injured and had to be sent to another town because they weren't really being cared for. So both groups kind of left the area, and it's not known if this was a prearranged battle, but there were warrants issued for the arrest of the leaders of both groups, who police were actually unable to identify. So although the tension remained high through the summer of 1899, and there were some minor battles and clashes, the Newburgh police were able to secure the brickyards and avoid any other major race riots in Newburgh that year.